We're going to get going in about 2 minutes. 2 minutes. And Keith will be going live. Come on down. Good luck with that.
We are a big crew.
Oh yeah. Oh.
Yeah.
We're getting still getting people online, and people are getting used to coming back. So
Yeah, I know it's my book tour has been very much the same.
yeah.
Hit or miss. Some places it's great. Some places literally the smallest audience I've ever been in front of. I went to Houston and spoke in front of 6 people. I was like, this is smaller than my family.
That's right. We ready, Keith? Okay, good morning, everybody. I want to make sure we use every last second that we have. Welcome to the forum. Welcome to everyone gathered here. Welcome to all of you who are gathered online. My name is Mike Kinman. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the rector here at All Saints Church. And just thrilled to have back in our midst Reza Aslan, an amazing friend of All Saints Church, to talk about really an extraordinary new book that he's written that has so much to do with what is happening in Iran right now. So just for the uninitiated, Reza Aslan is a leading expert on world religions, a writer, professor, and Emmy and Peabody nominated producer. He is the author of 3 internationally best-selling books, including the #1 New York Times bestseller, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. His latest book is this, and we have copies for sale from Vroman's. We're only taking credit cards, but if you have cash, you can just walk down the streets to Vroman's and get it. But we have books for sale. Debbie Daniels is over there. I highly recommend it. It is called An American Martyr in Persia, The Epic Life and Tragic Death of Howard Baskerville. This was a book I was reading. I would get up and read part of it every morning, and I would have to literally stop myself. It's like, okay, I have to get on with my day to put this down. He's perhaps best known as the spouse of Jessica Jackley, co-founder of Kiva, and the founder of Altruists, which offers at-home, kid-friendly volunteer projects for families. And you were in our forum a while ago talking about that, and we're kind of working together on that. So, to the whole family, welcome to All Saints Church. It's really welcoming you to your home, so it's good having you around. This is such the perfect time for us to have a conversation, because not only do you have this fascinating new book, it is such an important foundation, not only of the revolution in 1979 that you and your family fled from, but the uprisings going on right now. So I want to get to that, but I want to start with the book. So first of all, who is Howard Baskerville, and what compelled you to write this story, not just about him, but about this period in Persian history?
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here, and that is my crew over there. We're usually the loud people up on the balcony. And so, yes. If you have ever had just random pieces of paper fall on your head in the middle of service, that's us. So it's wonderful to be back at Forum. Howard Baskerville was a 22-year-old Christian missionary from Nebraska who, in 1907, was assigned to go to Persia, modern-day Iran, in order to teach English and to preach the gospel. And he happened to arrive in Persia, in the northwest city of Tabriz, smack dab in the middle of the first democratic revolution in the Middle East and the first of three major revolutions of the 20th century in Iran. It's called the Constitutional Revolution. Essentially what had happened is about a year earlier, a group of young revolutionaries backed by business interests in the country and the clergy poured out onto the streets of Iran demanding the creation of a constitution, a document that would lay out the rights and privileges of all the citizens in the country, and the creation of an elected parliament that would have not just the authority to pass legislation, but much more importantly, to curb the absolute authority of the Shah, a man by the name of Muzaffar ad-Din at the time. Shah, of course, just means king in Persia. And in December of 1906, they got it. They had a parliament that was elected. They had a constitution, a very progressive document that was written. And the Shah, under intense pressure, signed that constitution in December of 1906 and then promptly died. And his son, a 35-year-old man by the name of Muhammad Ali, not that Muhammad Ali, Muhammad Ali Shah, took his father's place on the throne. And the thing you have to understand about Muhammad Ali Shah is that he was raised to believe that the throne was his by birthright, right? That God had given him Persia as his own personal property. And he was incensed with his father for having allowed for any curbing of that authority. And so it took a while, but throughout most of 1907, when he first came to power, along with his Russian backers, he was backed by the Russian Empire at the time, he declared war on the constitutionalists. He tore up the Constitution. He sent his Russian-made cannons to the Parliament building, and he blew up the building with the parliamentarians still inside. They were in the middle of a session. And then he essentially began to reconquer the whole of the country back for the crown. The whole of the country, except for one city, and that city was Tabriz, the city where Howard Baskerville just suddenly arrived. And it took him a while. He was there for about a year, teaching and preaching, and really falling in love with the country and the culture and the people. And also, was deeply invested in this revolution. He, on a whole other topic, he was a student of Woodrow Wilson at Princeton. And so he was somebody who truly understood kind of the nature of what was taking place in this country that he had just suddenly popped up in. But he was told repeatedly by his school that he was teaching at, by the church that had sent him to Persia, and most importantly by the United States government, that this was none of his business, that whatever was taking place around him had nothing to do with him, and that he was there to teach, he was there to preach, and as an American citizen, he could have absolutely nothing to do with this conflict. And he, kind of obeyed for the most part. He put his head down. He tried to ignore what was going on. But as the situation, as this kind of what was now really a civil war, it was no longer a revolution at this point, a civil war between the royalists loyal to the Shah and the nationalists loyal to the Constitution, began to kind of coalesce around the city of Tabriz. He eventually felt like he had no choice in order to really address the suffering of the people on the streets, but to quit his job as a teacher, and to abandon his post as a missionary, and then ultimately even to abandon his citizenship and to take up arms and fight alongside his own students against the Shah in this fight for freedom.
It cost him his life.
Yes.
I mean, the title is an American Martyr in
That's right.
Persia.
Yeah. Spoiler alert. Thanks, Mike. No, I'm just kidding. Yes. So, to kind of get to the end of the story, and it's a dramatic up and down sort of one of these crazy but true stories. after many, many months of trying to defeat Tabriz, this city that became the last bastion of the revolution, and failing, the Shah ultimately decided to change tactics, and in the winter of 1909, decided to blockade the city instead and cut off all food and water, and then just simply starve the population into submission. And what took place is what is, even to this day, a very famous, very important moment in Iranian history. It's a moment that's still taught in every high school in Iran, called the Siege of Tabriz. Thousands and thousands of people died of starvation. People were, crawling on their hands and knees and eating tufts of grass and boiling their shoes. It was a horrific, horrific famine. And at a certain point on April 20th in 1909, there was no more food left in the city. It was basically either die trying to break the siege or die in the city. And so Howard Baskerville and his students volunteered to become the sort of tip of the spear in an attempt to break through the siege and bring food to the city. They didn't get very far. Howard Baskerville was shot in the heart in the attempt. But his death and the international embarrassment that it caused forced, not the Shah, he couldn't care less, but it forced the Russians to basically force the Shah to declare a ceasefire so that food and medical supplies could enter Tabriz. And the revolutionaries used that pause in fighting to break through the walls, march on Tehran, and bring the Shah down from his throne. They sent him off into exile. They re-established the Constitution. Testing? Okay, there we go. They re-established the Constitution. They rebuilt the parliament. And among the first acts of the new parliament was to declare this 22-year-old Christian missionary from Nebraska to be a national hero and a martyr for the cause of freedom in Iran. And to your question of
Aquí, and yeah, just shut it up.
oh, there we go. It keeps. I think maybe the battery is a little bit low, but okay, there we go. And he had this incredible funeral in Tabriz. His tomb is still there. For many, many years, it was a kind of pilgrimage site. There's this beautiful golden bust of him in a museum in Tabriz, and for generations, his story was told in Iran. I kind of mentioned in the book that when I was a kid growing up in Iran, almost everybody knew who Howard Baskerville was. There were schools named after him, streets named after him. But of course, since the '79 revolution, that memory has essentially been wiped from the collective consciousness of most Iranians. It's very hard to find anyone, certainly under the age of 50, in Iran who still remembers who Howard Baskerville was. But as tragic as that is, even more tragic is the fact that no one in America ever knew who he was in the first place. So it's not like we forgot him, we just never knew him. And as I explained in the book, that wasn't by accident. The Presbyterian Church, which had sent him to Tabriz, and the American government had a lot of incentives to make sure that his story was never really known. The church, for obvious reasons, it can't be, if you could imagine the idea that, one of your missionaries might just take up arms against the government where he's serving, that's an existential crisis for the Presbyterian Church. So they had every reason to stifle that story and make sure it did not spread. But the American government, too, it is, although I have to remind people of this because we forget, it's technically illegal for an American citizen to fight in a foreign war. Although I feel like that's really happening a lot. Yeah. We have American citizens who literally joined the IDF, which is odd, but okay. And so the American government also had every reason to stifle that story. In fact, I quote there was a lot of, as you can imagine, a lot of consternation, a lot of debate, a lot of angst in the church and at the State Department when Howard Baskerville had sort of abandoned everything to join the revolution. And then when he died, there was this memo that was sent from the American legate in Tehran, kind of the ambassador, to the State Department. And the memo says very clearly, Mr. Baskerville's death seems to have simplified matters. And so it was sort of a thing where it's like, okay, he's dead, it's over, nobody needs to talk about this anymore. And I just wanted, it's an incredible story, and it's one that I've always known. And I just feel like both in Iran and in America, this is a name that needs to be heard again.
Well, I mean, one of the things as I was reading it, I thought this thing has like 8-episode HBO Max miniseries written all over it.
Working on it.
Well, yeah, it's an amazing story. And one of the things, and you just touched on this, that was just really compelling to me is sort of, you talked about the existential crisis it was for the Presbyterian Church. And from my point of view, I mean, we're at a church, we say we walk with a revolutionary Jesus, to say, oh, God forbid someone would actually live the gospel, so much that they would actually kind of do what we think Jesus did, which is join with people at their most oppressed and fight for them.
See, I'm so glad you said this, Mike, because this is an important point. And there was a lot of rumors swirling around, when he first joined the revolution, that he had abandoned Christianity. That was a big thing, that, in abandoning his mission, he'd abandoned his faith. And there was also a lot of people who thought, he went there to convert Muslims to Christianity, and he ended up converting to Islam. Is that what happened? And no, it's funny because, that's what I'd always heard, those rumors, and it always seemed as though this was an issue that was unclear. And then the most basic research that I did, I found letters that he had written to his mother before he died, letters that he had written to the American consul, in which he lays out in as clear terms what he was doing and why. And he made it very clear that this wasn't him abandoning his missionary enterprise. This was him doing mission work. That he honestly believed that the year or so that he'd been preaching this gospel, and frankly not having all that much success preaching this gospel, in the midst of a moment in which these people were willingly sacrificing themselves for the freedoms that he took for granted, that what he truly believed is that what I need to do as a Christian is stop talking about what Jesus would do and actually do what Jesus would do. And at the same time, obviously when he handed over his passport, when he was told, either stop what you're doing or we're going to arrest you, and they actually threatened him with treason, which was a strange word to use, but it is the word that they used. And so he just simply said, okay then, and he handed over his passport and said, I guess I'm not American anymore. And as you can imagine, that caused a lot of, rumors that, he's given up his American identity. But in these letters, again, he makes it very clear that this is him exerting his American identity, that the American government had sent a letter to all all American citizens in Iran when the revolution had started, warning them in no uncertain terms that they can have nothing to do with this fight because the American government is declaring neutrality. Not because America had some vested interests in Iran. This was 1907. America didn't even know where Iran was. Like, we had no interests in the Middle East back then. That would come later. But because, in the words of this State Department memo, history has shown that there has never been anything like a democratic country where, Muslims are the majority. That, quote, Islam seems to imply autocracy. And so this revolution is a fool's errand. It's bound to fail, so we can certainly not support it in any way. And for Baskerville to say that, okay, this passport that I've been using to protect myself for the last year or so, I'm just going to hand this over to you, and I'm going to go and do what I think an American would do, which is fight for the freedom of individuals against an autocratic regime and a monarch, no less. And I think that's an important part of it, is that this was a man who, as I've preached in this church, right? Faith without works is dead, and he truly believed that, and he decided that he was just going to put his identity and his faith into practice, even if it meant sacrificing himself.
Well, and one of the, that's worth some applause, I would say. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and clearly, and I want to move to talk about sort of the roots and what's going on today, but I kept coming back to what's happening in our country today, which is, this was not, Howard Baskerville's story is not, as you've just said, Christianity versus Islam. He was fighting side by side with his students, for whom the Constitutional Revolution was an article of faith. This is what they believed God would want for them. It was about for people who wanted to use their faith for the good of the people, and people who wanted to use their faith as a power to rule over the people. And we see this happening in our country today with the rise of Christian nationalism and the attempt to demonize other faiths. Well, the truth is, we have common cause with those who would want to use faith to help people, to free people, basically, is it faith to liberate or faith to dominate? And so, how do you see that theme running through this?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because at the time, this was the most sort of successful and well-known anti-imperialist revolution in the world. The success of Tabriz in maintaining the Constitution in the face of an imperial army and Russian commanders was extraordinary. And so at a certain point in the midst of this battle, the revolutionaries in Tabriz send out this thing that they call the National Manifesto. It's basically a letter that they send to all the capitals of Europe, all the capitals of North America. And the letter basically says, if you open the heart of a British man, won't it look like the heart of a Persian? If you open the heart of a Japanese, won't it look like the heart of a Russian? Please put away the prejudice of your nationality, the bigotry of your creeds, the prejudice of your nationality, the bigotry of your creeds, and help us. Come and help us. And it was extraordinary. It actually worked. All of a sudden, all these Russians and Georgians and Armenians and Turks, Christians, Jews, Baha'is, Zoroastrians, Buddhists, Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, all poured into Tabriz to take part in this fight. And so the Revolutionary Army that I was talking about wasn't just Persians. It was this multi-ethnic, multinational, multi-religious coalition with one American, just one American. And it was precisely as you say, everyone was there, and they all had their sort of, their different faiths, their different nationalities, their different ethnicities, their different languages. They all had these completely different backgrounds, yet they were all united by this single idea that freedom from tyranny is God's will, right? Doesn't matter what you call that God, doesn't matter what language you pray to that God, that the idea that there is freedom and there is tyranny, and it's very clear which side God falls on, was as clear as it got. And it was an extraordinary movement. There's this moment not long before actually Baskerville dies, where the American Consul General comes to him in the training field, where they're doing drills and they're preparing, for battle. And the American Consul General is basically trying one last time. He's already tried a bunch of times, but it's just one last time to get this kid off the battlefield and get him back to America. And he says to Howard Baskerville, "This is not your fight. This is not your country. These are not your people." And Baskerville very famously responds, "The only difference between me and these people is the place of my birth. And that is not a very big difference." And I think that message, it's like 115 years later, where we are so locked in the prejudice of nationality and the bigotry of creed, right? That message of like, who cares? None of this matters, that there's no difference. It's just you were born there and I was born here. You call God by this name, I call God by this name. But fundamentally, we all, strive for the same thing, is one that I hope gets across from this book today.
Well, I think it absolutely does. And you mentioned the moment where the American response to Howard Baskerville's death was, well, this simplifies things, and that he was problematic. And I think about, oh my gosh, how the worm has turned for America in what was then Persia and now Iran is, the time that you're writing, the power of colonialism was primarily Great Britain and Russia. Those were the two forces, and a little bit Germany, but really primarily Great Britain and Russia. And the experience of America, it sounds like, was filtered through this one person who was seen, probably the rank and file people in Persia didn't know that America had disavowed him. This was just something. And so this is like an impossible task. Walk us through what happened. I mean, first of all, what if America had decided, yes, we're going to lift up Howard Baskerville instead of disavowing him. We're going to learn the problems of colonialism instead of imitating them and magnifying them. So sort of walk us through what happened after World War I and II through Mossadegh and to 79.
So in 1909, not long after Baskerville's death and the triumph of the revolution, Iran becomes a constitutional monarchy. And it's sort of this extraordinary, very, very brief moment in Iranian history where, the Shah is a figurehead and the parliament maintains, control over the country, etc. That's 1909. But of course, just a few years later, the Great War begins. And Iran, as you rightly say, becomes essentially a staging ground for that conflict. The Russians controlled the north of the country, the British controlled the south of the country, and throughout the devastation of that war, Iran becomes essentially a resource, if you will, for the great empires battling against the Ottoman Empire and Germany. And essentially what happens is at the end of that war, leaves Iran bankrupt and crumbling. And then very quickly, the Spanish flu goes through the country, kills something like 25% of the entire population. And so you have, in the wake of that war, this period of crisis, of social, economic, and political crisis in which, as the Iranians learn very quickly, democracy has a hard time coming up with quick and easy answers for. And so in 1921, but with the backing of the British, a Iranian military commander by the name of Reza Khan marches his troops into Tehran and declares a military coup. Tears up the constitution, closes down parliament, and then surprisingly, 3 years later, instead of maintaining the military dictatorship, declares himself the next Shah and starts what we know as the Pahlavi regime.
Yeah, remember that name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Reza Shah becomes the first king, this kind of illiterate, military commander, and of course, and then in the Second World War, when Reza Shah refused to join the Allies against the Axis powers, the British removed him from power, put his son on the throne, Mohammad Reza Shah, and that is the last Shah of Iran. That's the Shah that gets thrown out in 1979 in the final revolution. But what happens sort of starting in the 1950s is that America starts to pay attention to Iran, mainly because of the oil. And just to take you through very, very quickly through what happened, some of you may be familiar with the 1953 revolution. So I said there were three revolutions: 1906, the Constitutional Revolution. In 1953, Another sort of nationalist uprising kicks Mohammad Reza Shah out of Iran and puts this prime minister named Mossadegh into power. And the first thing that Mossadegh does is nationalize the oil, which was completely under British control. And the British, who post Second World War are themselves in no position to sort of maintain, the empire, ask their good friends, the United States, for help. The United States sends the very, very first CIA foreign mission ever. So this was when the CIA, post-Second World War, was just forming and trying to figure out exactly, what do we do anyway? What does the CIA do now that the war is done? And a man by the name of Kermit Roosevelt comes up with a pretty good idea. Why don't we go and bring Mossadegh down? And so they do. A very famous moment in American and Iranian history called Operation Ajax, where the CIA essentially creates this fake counter-protest, removes Mossadegh and puts the Shah back on the throne. And then the British say, wow, thank you so much. And, we appreciate it. And, good luck with everything. And America says, yeah, now that we're here, I think we'll stay. And thus begins the sort of very long entanglement of the United States in Iranian affairs, which ultimately, again, ends in 1979 with that revolution.
Well, and so one of the, and again, it's like history repeats itself over and over and over again. And, towards the end of the book, when you talk about when Muhammad Ali Shah was deposed, and then the vacuum that was there, I was reminded of one of George Washington's lines in Hamilton, winning was easy, young man, governing's harder.
Yeah.
There's the what's next question, and we saw this in 79. And I don't know what you think of the HBO miniseries that just came out, if you've even seen that.
I haven't had a chance to see it yet, but
it's
I'm
really
quite
interesting
familiar
because
with
it's the first time that I've seen some of the former students who were hostage takers interviewed.
Yeah.
What appears clear, and you would have a much better sense of this, of course, than I would, is that when the students took the embassy, they thought it was going to be 24 to 48 hours, but then the mullahs, and particularly Ayatollah Khomeini, realized the power that he had and came in and filled the vacuum when the Shah was gone in ways that many of the students did not want. And just continued with his own brand of oppression under a different name. In the Arab Spring in Egypt, we saw, Mubarak go to Morsi, go to El-Sisi, and it's sort of like, okay, we've removed someone, but then the easiest thing to do is to have another authoritarian come into place. Go fast forward to today. First of all, what do you see happening with, and it's so amazing and not surprising that it is women who are leading this. But part of where my brain goes is, okay, if they get the mullahs removed, then what? So, what are you seeing right now?
First of all, you're so right, and I want to emphasize what you said about 79, because it's been 40-something years, and there's been a lot of post-revolutionary propaganda, and indeed, oftentimes we even refer to the 79 revolution as the Islamic Revolution, but it was not an Islamic revolution. It had communists and Marxists and progressives and liberals, and yes, the clergy as well. And again, everyone, different ideas, different hopes and aspirations for what would come next, but united in this single call that the Shah must go. And after that revolution, there was a provisional government in place that was beginning the process of reestablishing that constitution and making sure that relations with the West were maintained. And very soon after that, after President Carter allowed the Shah into the United States, a group of graduate students at a engineering school thought, oh, it's 53 again. Here we go. We kicked out this exact same Shah 40 years earlier, and America put him right back on the throne. They're about to do that again. And so to keep that from happening, they staged a 2-day sit-in at the embassy. They were unarmed. This is all to say that everything you saw in Argo is nonsense. Uh, they were unarmed. They brought provisions for 2 days. They were armed with signs. That's what they had, and they wanted to do a sit-in. And the idea was, we're going to sit here to make sure that Carter does not send the CIA in again. And Khomeini, in this sort of vacuum of power that existed there, saw this and said, very famously, this is the real revolution, not what happened in '79. This is the real revolution. And took advantage of the students and forced the provisional government to collapse as a result, and then took power over the country and turned it into the Islamic Republic that we know today. And to your point, now that we're seeing this remarkable fourth revolution, I think is how I would refer to it, taking place in Iran, once again, we're seeing a disparate coalition of interests and values. Yes, it is a women-led feminist movement. That's what sparked this, but it has now brought in men, older generations, more conservatives. People, we're seeing women dressed head to toe in chadors, the sort of traditional conservative Islamic dress, standing next to women in jeans and T-shirts, both of them chanting for the downfall of the government. We're seeing business interests start to take part in this. And the question becomes, and this is a question that a lot of people are asking, is this just '79 again? Are they all united in this singular call, the regime must go, and then what? And it is a legitimate fear. But I will say that there is something different this time. And that is that Iran has had, going all the way back to the Constitutional Revolution, a century of a robust, active, political culture. And over the last 4 decades, that culture has resulted in extraordinarily high levels of education and literacy, and an experience of what representative government looks like. Again, I want to remind you that Iran is a 2-tiered government, right? It does have a president that's elected freely, no, but elected, and you get a choice, this limited choice, a parliament and a judiciary, but on top of all of that is the sort of clerical regime, and they control everything else that happens. But Iranians have used what little representation they get to exert their voice repeatedly in the last 4 decades. And so while that fear of a vacuum once again being, swallowed up by some other kind of, tyrannical force is definite and real, I do believe that the foundation exists now in Iran to create something that is far more democratic than I think we've seen in Iran since the days of Howard Baskerville's death.
So what I wonder, so we watch this happening, and like we have, as you know, we do an action every week, and our action this week is asking the UN representative from the United States to sort of help out and legitimize what is happening in Iran. And I think part of this is, and actually we're doing a whole bunch of work on white supremacy culture here at All Saints Church, and so part of white supremacy culture is we think we need to step in and do something. And so what I look at, first of all, I think, wow, I really want to do something. I want to support these amazing people because, I want to take the best of what Howard Baskerville did and say, the only difference is the place of my birth, and we have this common cause with anyone who is standing for freedom, for tyranny. I also recognize that as Americans, we don't have a good track record in a lot of places, and particularly Iran, and there's a lot of baggage that comes with anything that we do. And so just even starting small, like All Saints Church, is there a Howard Baskerville role for us? Or have we already done too much?
No, it's so important. It's funny, there isn't much of a role for the U.S. government to play in Iran because we've had a 4-decade policy of blanket sanctions as a means of trying to remove this regime and This isn't just my personal opinion. It's backed by reams and reams of academic evidence which says that that blanket policy, blanket sanctions policy, has only further entrenched the regime in power. And so, the problem with that kind of policy is that we can't influence Iran, really. We can't influence the government. We can't punish them because there's nothing left to punish them with. But you're absolutely right that the United Nations has a role to play in what's happening in Iran, and thus far has, for baffling reasons, remained silent, has not even sort of had a vote or to condemn the actions of the government, has not called for an investigation of what's happening in Iran, and this is a government that has admitted explicitly, openly, that it is now rounding up teenagers and sending them to psychological camps. I mean, when you're just blatantly admitting international violations of human rights laws, you're begging for some kind of response, and hopefully that response will come. But the more important question is, what can Americans do? And I know it sounds small, but it's not. Paying attention is the most important thing that you can do. When you ask the Iranians on the streets who are sacrificing themselves for their most basic rights, what do you want from the world? They say over and over again, listen to us, pay attention to us. This is a government that is trying to convince its people that nobody cares, that nobody's listening, that at any minute now they could just turn off the lights and just slaughter everyone, and that'll be the end of that. And the fact that we saw 100,000 people in Berlin yesterday rallying for the Iranians, that downtown Los Angeles was chock full of people, that plays such a crucial role, not just in fortifying the people on the streets themselves, right? Making them feel like it's working, people hear us, people listen, people are watching, but it also keeps the Iranian government on its toes, because the more they know that the world is watching, the more that they understand that there will be consequences for the bloodletting that they have released onto the streets. So don't let anyone tell you that, your tweets don't matter, your Facebook posts don't matter. If you ask the people on the ground in Iran, they matter a lot. So pay attention. That's it. Elevate those voices.
Amen. We got about 5 minutes left in here, and then if we can stay another maybe 10 minutes in here after the stream goes away, I really want to have a chance to get to some questions from you all. What do we have over here? Actually, I'll start over here with you, Norm, and then go up here. Cheryl.
Reza, knowing your history, I presume in any given year you have many possible book projects. So why at this particular time did you choose this project?
It's funny. I've always known this story, and people have asked me over the last few weeks, as I've been on tour, when did you first hear this story? When did you first? And I don't know the answer to that question. It's almost like, so when did you first hear the story of George Washington chopping the cherry tree? You just kind of always knew it. Difference being that story is nonsense and this one is true, but nevertheless, it's always kind of rattled around in my head. And after my last book, God, A Human History, I sort of publicly vowed never to write another book of religious history again, because that book almost killed me. And so I was looking for a different kind of story, but one that has always animated me, right? The stories that, if you look at all of my works, whether it's books or whether it's film and television, whatever, it's always just the same story again. It's always about an individual who, when confronted with some intolerable situation, activates his or her faith and uses that to affect change. That's Moses. That's Jesus. That's Muhammad. And it's Baskerville. And so this may feel like a different kind of book than I've published, but in reality, it's pretty much the same story.
I just have one question and one brief comment. My question is, why does it happen that politics and religion both fight so much and also hold hands so often? That's the question. And the comment is about Anthony Bourdain, who did a segment on Iran, got in there, and, brought, I think, incredibly large audience, a sense that we don't know that much about Iran, but here's the version of it.
Yeah, and Mike kind of mentioned this a little bit. He hinted at this, that the Iranian people are the most pro-American population, not just in the Middle East, maybe the world, honestly. Part of that has to do with the fact that the government of Iran is so anti-American that just reflexively the people are pro-American. They're just like, oh yeah, which, by the way, is the opposite of the days of the Shah, right? The Shah was so married to America that the population was just reflexively anti-American. And yes, I think that's the thing that anyone who's visited Iran or spoken to Iranians, it's sort of the first thing that kind of blows their mind is how much they love Americans. And they also have the ability to differentiate between the American people and the American government in a way that we are not very good at doing. Wait, I lost the question. Oh, right. Yes, politics and religion. Well, not to get too academic, but the reason is because politics and religion are just markers of identity. They're just ways of identifying ourselves. There you go. This is the first thing that I learned when I started studying religions, but it blew my mind and it changed everything for me, is that religion is far less a matter of beliefs and practices than it is a matter of identity. When you say, I am Christian, I am Jewish, I am Muslim, I am Buddhist, more often than not, you're not making a faith statement, you're making an identity statement. And as an identity statement, it's going to be wrapped up in all the other sort of factors of your identity, right? Including your politics, but also your ethnicity, your gender, your sexual orientation, your socioeconomic status. And so as these two big forms of identity markers, you can see why they interact so often. And it doesn't come as a surprise. Doesn't mean it's a good thing, but it's not the surprising thing.
We're going to say goodbye to our streamers right now, but we're going to stay here in the room for a few more minutes. So those of you who have been, everyone turn and wave at the camera. Thanks for joining us. You're going to be back on in the church at 10 a.m., but we're going to stick around here for a couple more questions here in the house. Randy.